Hello, I'm Hannah Murray from the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. This seminar is part of an occasional series about doing things differently, looking at society, politics and economics during and after the COVID-19 crisis. It's presented in partnership with the university's Creative Manchester initiative and the Policy and Evidence Centre. So the current health crisis, as we know, has impacted the entire cultural and creative sector. The Creative Industries Federation suggests that it will be hit twice as hard as the wider UK economy in 2020. And as much as the sector awaits further clarity on government support, its future remains uncertain. Yet, more than ever, the importance of culture and creativity in society is clear. During lockdown, many cultural professionals published free online content, reaching audiences, supporting mental health, well-being and community inclusion. Similarly, innovation can be seen in the public's response, combining creativity and performance to entertain, collaborate and communicate. These responses both reflect on and document life during the crisis and will be integral to our cultural memory of this time. So how might we archive this activity and ensure the diversity of experiences are represented? And as the traditional spaces of our cultural institutions continue to be challenged, how might they connect, sustain and diversify their audiences? Integral to these questions is the relationship that these institutions have and would like to develop with their communities, and the way in which they adapt will be critical. So to discuss today's issues, we've brought together academics and professionals from the University of Manchester and its cultural partners. Dr. Abigail Gilmore, Senior Lecturer in Arts Management here at the University of Manchester, will be chairing the discussion. So I'll now pass over to you, Abby.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's great to be able to find a space to talk about it, particularly with such an esteemed company. So just a quick introduction to myself. As Hannah said, I'm Abigail Gilmore and I'm based at the Institute for Cultural Practices, and I am the Programme Director and founder of an MA in Arts Management. My current research has been looking at public parks and also the way that museums that are co-located within them are kind of how they're working together, and so that's been an interesting time looking at how people's cultural participation in public parks has been changing over the course of lockdown. But I'm also a co-investigator on the Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, which is a very long title. I'm delighted to say that our first panellist today, Giorgio Vazio, is here with us, and he's also a co-investigator. We're also joined by Becky Parnell, who's from Manchester Camerata, but also employed by the University of Manchester under the Creative Manchester initiative. And we have Wendy Gallagher, who's the Head of Learning and Engagement at Manchester Museum, and who's kind of deeply embedded in the museum's sort of groundbreaking New Hello Future development project. And finally, Kostas Arvanitis, who is a Senior Lecturer with the Centre for Museology at the Institute for Cultural Practices. So without further ado, I'll move to our first panellist, Giorgio, and ask him if he can tell us a bit about the PEC, but also a bit of the kind of current research or research objectives of the PEC and how they might support and develop policy and evidence for recovery from the pandemic for the creative sector. So over to you, Giorgio.
Thank you, Abby. I'd like to thank you and the University of Manchester and Anna for organizing this webinar. Essentially, we are a center that has been funded by the HRC under the Industrial Strategy and the Creative Industries Cluster program that has the objective to provide a step change for industry policymakers and researchers. The objective is to research that can be impactful and sustain the growth of the creative industries. So I wanted to discuss a bit how a network like ours that wants to be able to respond with agility to pressing new issues have responded to something so dramatic like what happened this year. Just like anybody, I think we've been affected. On the research side, we thought about the impact on the creative industries, but we also thought about the role of the creative industries, how creative industries have been badly affected, as Anna said previously, but they've also reacted in a very resilient way wherever possible. And they've actually helped a lot with respect to two important issues that affect the success of non-pharmaceutical interventions. Now, these interventions can have two issues. One issue is that, of course, lockdown and staying at home can generate fatigue in people, and therefore, in a way, the creative industries providing additional content and moving online, they've actually helped people coping better with the staying at home message. And at the same time, there is fatigue in terms of public messaging. And again, the creative industries have had and can have a role in terms of improving public health messaging, and therefore a role in, let's say, flattening the curve. And we believe that this role should be recognized and supported. And a lot of people talk about being ready for a possible second wave, so our attention should still be in this kind of space. Another piece of work that is extremely important is a survey on online cultural consumption that the PEC has co-commissioned together with the Intellectual Property Office and AudienceNet research agency. The study has followed a cohort of 1,000 people aged 16 and plus over a 6 weeks period that contains the lockdown period. Now, the OCI tracker normally monitors infringement behavior, but also contains a lot of information on consumption of specific categories and online behavior. There are some interesting results that emerged from the study. In particular, a drop in well-being and increase in anxiety from the beginning of the lockdown. At the same time, what is interesting and important is that all consumption categories seem to have had a role in terms of helping people deal with this increased stress and anxiety. And also there has been a reported increase in consumption of online content, which mostly peaks around week 1 or 2, and then slightly declines over the observed period. But also people have started embracing a wider range of non-traditional content, which is also an interesting result. What is interesting to observe is an increase in consumption of video games compared to other categories, and both in terms of share of individuals, but also in terms of paid online content. It is observed a decrease in the use of illegal sources, especially for streaming. Now, there are some future steps. I'd like to draw your attention to the forthcoming publication of a final report on the 6-week study. The plan is also to dig into the richness of the microdata and investigate important issues. Some of these are clearly the determinants of consumption patterns, but also socioeconomic consumption choice. And an important issue which is emerging with respect to COVID-19, which is inequality, and especially in terms of the digital divide, but also the relationship between well-being and consumption of culture. And also, it has already been commissioned a new data collection for the post-lockdown period, so that it is possible to compare these results to a period where people were not in such an extreme context like the lockdown. This is all from me at the moment. I'm open to any questions.
Okay, thank you, Giorgio, for that introduction to the PEC. Like you say, there's clearly a lot of work, a lot of research going on that is responsive to the lockdown, but also is drawing on other kind of research instruments and data collection, which will hopefully in time also support the kind of actions of arts and culture and creative organisations, as well as supporting broader policy and investment decisions. Thinking about some of the findings that you were talking about then from the OCI tracker study, I'd like to turn to Becky next, because thinking about audiences and thinking about how we know audience or participant behaviour is in terms of consumption. For the classical music sector that you work with, Becky, there's always been a question about audiences and audience development, and how can the classical sector, how can orchestras keep relevant and keep growing their audiences, and I know that that's been something that you've been looking at in your own work. So Could you say a little bit about the impact of kind of the pandemic in your field, and also particularly the orchestra Manchester Camerata, how Manchester Cameratas kind of responded? What's been your experience, and what's to come?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think Manchester Camerata has a well-deserved reputation for innovation, and we were committed to challenging the perceptions of orchestras prior to COVID-19. But of course, this crisis has forced all orchestras and arts organisations to take a step back, to reevaluate their purpose and their positioning. And as Abby said, my research prior to COVID was focused on audiences, genre perception, and the idea of orchestras perhaps being considered genreless in the 21st century. But when this crisis hit, I decided to refocus, and instead I've been looking at the digital presentation of orchestral music. I've been looking at practical considerations such as platform and monetization, reading around the topic of audience development in the digital space. And I think there's a significant gap in research in this area, as I'm sure colleagues have discovered. And this is something that I hope to be able to contribute to over the coming months as I work with colleagues to produce a new digital series of concerts that we're working on at the moment. And I can't say too much about it at this stage, but we go into production tomorrow, so we're all very excited about it. But for this new series that we're working on, we've taken time to consider what we initially saw as the limitations of the digital space and looked at how we can utilize these limitations to create engaging and original content, with research underpinning the artistic and practical decisions that we make along the way. The series is going to be multidisciplinary. It's going to incorporate specially written spoken word alongside classical and non-classical music, and it's going to be produced and directed by a TV film crew. And one of the big discussions in the sector at the moment is that of monetization of digital content. And as Hannah mentioned in her introduction, when the lockdown first happened, there was a large amount of free content made available, which was a great opportunity for us to make steps to potentially democratize orchestral music and increase accessibility. But this has left us with a public who are able to access content of extremely high quality, free of charge, and arts organisations with, of course, no ticket income. So the question of monetisation is one that we're keen to explore, as well as looking into practical considerations, things like what devices are people using to access online content? How much are they paying, or how much would they consider to pay? Are they watching content while doing chores or emails in the background? And what types of content are they engaging with? And to help us look into those questions, we surveyed our audience. We developed a survey examining our audience's attitudes and habits around online arts presentation. The results revealed some interesting insights into people's habits. We were looking at 89% of respondents would consider paying either a set ticket price or to donate a pay-as-they-feel donation for such content. And these results that we got were similar to the results of the second set of data from the National Audience Research carried out by Indigo, which was titled After the Interval, which found that over 2/3 of respondents would pay to watch a new piece of work created during lockdown, which is obviously great news for the industry, for the future of digital. And given that it looks likely that we won't be returning to normal for some time, and that we're all missing the shared experience of live performance, we think it's really imperative now that we take this opportunity to fully explore the digital space and to adapt our projects accordingly. And another example of this type of innovation, aside from our digital concert series, is Manchester Camerata's Music in Mind remote project. And with the help of a grant from Innovate UK, Manchester Camerata is working closely with the Innovation Factory here at the university to develop a set of high quality digital resources which will enable our groundbreaking dementia work to be accessed remotely by those living in care homes. And of course, there are a huge number of challenges facing our sector, including the devastating effect on freelancers, and I don't want to diminish the problems and paint a purely positive picture of the industry, but I think we need to remain optimistic to push forward. And if I were to quickly sum up Manchester Camerata's response to the crisis, I would say that we are innovating rather than preserving. Some organisations, of course, out of necessity, are using this time to put out digital content to preserve their audience until they're able to go back to business as usual. But we're seeking to create content to innovate and experiment with new concepts during this time, using research to inform this new direction.
Thank you. I mean, it's great to hear positivity at a time like this, and with good reason, it sounds, because in some ways, some of the issues for classical music that are attached to the venues or the ordinary spaces, many of which Manchester Camerata has a tradition of moving away from anyway. But some of the issues around audience development, I think it's fair to say, have been attached to the kind of spaces where people are expected to come and the ways that they're expected to behave when experiencing live classical music. And so in this case, it sounds like there really is good grounds to think about innovation in terms of digital participation, and that may really change the kind of the genre of classical music audiencing and the types of audiences that you reach. I wanted to move on to Wendy and hear a little bit about her work with the Manchester Museum. How, at this current time, has the museum and has your work been affected by the pandemic, particularly in relation to how you reach communities if they can't come in to see you, but or if you've got community engagement programs where you're reaching out to them anyway? In what ways have you been kind of responding to the crisis, or in what ways has it impacted on your work?
Well, I'll just give a little bit of context about Manchester Museum first, if that's okay, before answering that question. It's part of the University of Manchester, and we are actually one of the largest university museums in the UK. It's known traditionally as an encyclopedic museum. You've got both human cultures and the natural world all under one roof. We've got really large collections, over 4.5 million objects across all sorts of disciplines. Before lockdown, we were actually only half open. We're in the midst of a large capital project, which is called Hello Future, which you referred to earlier. Even being half open, we had around 360,000 visitors a year. But more than ever, what we're looking at now is really asking, what's the museum for? Our mission is really quite straightforward. It's about building understanding between cultures and a more sustainable world. We're very clearly values driven. From the first moment that the doors were open in the late 19th century, it was an appeal to the civic spirit, curiosity and devotion of the townsfolk of Manchester. And that's still in its DNA. We are a university museum, absolutely at the heart of the university. So we do all the things that you would imagine a university museum to do, but we clearly have a really important civic role to play. So we're talking about being the most inclusive, imaginative, caring museum you'll encounter. What we really want to do is reflect the communities we serve. And we've got lots of work to do there. And we also want to frame caring, not just relating to the collections, but very much around people, ideas and relationships. So as we moved into lockdown, and it was very, very quickly that it happened, we wanted to think about our community engagement, not just beyond the museum, but actually looking at our staff first. Our first thing that we wanted to do when we went into COVID was really give staff a little bit of space just to set up their offices at home, think about the care responsibilities they've got. And for us, we knew it was really important about the well-being of our staff. Now, prior to lockdown, we'd already brought in to the museum an art therapist who was there to support staff, and we introduced a staff wellbeing programme as well called Boost, because going through a capital development presents its challenges itself, and the wellbeing of staff was at the heart of what we do to enable them to actually be more flexible, more agile and more adaptable, and I think that's required of all of us at the moment. So we very quickly were able to create a mobile site, and it's Manchester Museum in Quarantine. And this is where it gave us a chance to really explore and experiment what the digital is going to mean for us within the museum. And what we did initially was we didn't create any new content. We had plenty of content that we could work with. It's unbelievable. And I think in the cultural sector, particularly in museums and galleries and around learning engagement, we moved from one project to the next, always very conscious of wanting to create something new and fresh for our audience and visitors. And I sometimes think that we make things harder for ourselves when we've got such rich resources that we've already created that can be reshaped. So, as I say, we didn't really create anything new initially. We just tweaked it, changed it, made it fresher, spoke to some of our existing partners. And I think a good example of seeing how the digital can actually offer something really new that we can't do on site. So, for instance, we have Frog Friday online. Now, when we do our frog sessions, we're an unusual museum because we have a live animal collection, which is primarily reptiles and amphibians. But when we have visitors that come in to have sessions with the animals, we can only cater really for a maximum of 20. Well, our Frog Friday actually reaches thousands of people. You know, and it goes beyond the local, it goes beyond the national, it's international. We also have another programme called Museology, which is for parents and their babies. And it is specifically targeting parents that may have issues around attachment, or they may have postnatal depression. And we do this in partnership with health and social care sector, and it's through referrals, so it's a social prescribing. And again, these groups are very, very small when they're on site, and for people that maybe experience difficulties in parenting, coming into the museum setting can have its challenges itself. And what we've found is with the Museology online, again, our reach is extraordinary. So for the sessions, it's been in excess of 150 in each of those sessions. Again, we've also, we were very lucky to get some funding through the Heritage Fund, DCMS, for South Asian Heritage Month, and we're working in partnership to deliver a young people's programme. We also have the Our Shared Cultural Heritage. All of that is being delivered online. And it's been amazing actually how quickly we've been able to do that. What we're very, very aware of is how we actually upskill staff in terms of their digital abilities as well. So that's something that we are exploring. Initially as well, when we went into lockdown, it was important for us to contact many of the partners just to see what the need is. So we're really responding to the need, and we're looking at really what the city, what Manchester is requiring of a museum. What are they hoping a museum can do, can achieve, how it can support, whether it's the health sector or the educational sector. Schools have been particularly slow to respond, absolutely understandably, with all the issues that they're having to deal with at the moment, but they have all said, we will be coming back to you, and they're slowly now beginning to reconnect with us, and we're having conversations about how we might adapt our learning programmes in a manner that can be meaningful to them through these challenges. In terms of our partnerships, I think prior to the lockdown anyway, we were looking at how we have and create partnerships that are actually meaningful to the partners as well, in terms of the outcomes that they're looking for. So particularly in Manchester, we know that we've got a really diverse community. We have a very large demographic of people from South Asian heritage. As part of our capital development, we will have a new South Asian heritage gallery. And so we've created a collective of people there who are really interested in co-production. And that co-production, we're able to do that still digitally. And a really good example of this was the exhibition Jallianwala Bagh, which I don't know if any of the panelists here were able to visit, that exhibition, but it was in partnership with the Partition Museum in India. Now, the whole of the co-curation of that exhibition was actually done digitally, and that was prior to COVID, so we knew that this could work. It was an extraordinary exhibition in that it was telling the stories from a lived experience perspective. And so we were able to listen to and hear the voices of others and not of the curator within the gallery. Mm-hmm. And that really shifted the demographic of our visitors. So at the time, prior to the exhibition, I think our demographic of visitors from South Asian diaspora was around 6%. It equals at that across the city. And I think it's about creating meaningful exhibitions and programmes to the people within Manchester as well. So that's been a really big shift for us. And our director, Esme Ward, is particularly interested in how museums, her term is how we flex within the museum and how we become much more adaptable. So although we do have our teams, we have our learning engagement team, we have our curatorial and collections team, our commercial team, what we're creating is almost like a buddy scheme. So we're partnering up curators with people from my own team, learning engagement. We're partnering up people from the retail team with conservation. So we're really mixing up that traditional, which was once a traditional structure of how teams work within museums. It's been a little bit tricky in the beginning stages, but I think it's just becoming a natural way for us to work now. And we're actually, once Esme's back, she's currently on holiday at the moment, but we're really keen to have a session with museum staff of actually looking at what curatorship within museums might look like in the future, but also how that's going to be digitally. So within the Manchester Museum in Quarantine, if people go and visit that, we do have an encyclopedia of wondrous objects, so people are able to access the collections digitally. And a whole range of programmes. So even there are opportunities for digital volunteering as well, as well as a whole raft of resources for home educators, for schools, and for carers as well.
The impact of the pandemic, meaning people needed to act more agilely, but using digital, is allowing the museum to move outside and to escape the boundaries of its building. But it's also, from what you were saying, escaping some of the other kind of constraints of being an institution. So new types of partnership, new types of practice. So I kind of wanted to use that as a pivot to Kostas next. What's your view on how museums and museum professionals can help us understand what we learn from the pandemic, kind of what we want to keep, what we might want to preserve from this, what we might want to jettison. So I know you've been involved in thinking about how we might archive experiences of the pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure, yes, Abby. So my recent work has been on how museums and galleries kind of collect and document and archive and engage people with the kind of the aftermath of traumatic events such as terrorist attacks, and this was a particular kind of had a particular emphasis in the arena attack back in 2017 in Manchester, and the spontaneous memorials that were created after that attack, and how then the Manchester Art Gallery led the collecting of that memorial items, those memorial items, which have now become part of its collection. So I've been kind of thinking and kind of working on kind of this area of kind of museum walk around traumatic archives, traumatic collections, and which often relate to kind of initiatives of kind of rapid response collecting or documentation again. So there is an obvious role here for museums and galleries as institutions that try to create kind of local and national original kind of memory of events, of situations that we all experience. There have been a number of museums and gallery projects now trying to think about how creatively and they can respond to COVID-19 and the lockdown by engaging not just communities in the work that they do already, but also kind of creating different kinds of work and indeed collecting around those experiences. So there are a couple of questions, a couple of issues here in terms of how museums can become part or kind of lead this kind of work. And often, as I said, there's an emphasis on kind of the rapid response element. That a thing like this happened, the pandemic happened, and you almost feel kind of this responsibility to do something about it. And other panelists have already said how cultural institutions try to make their content available to different kind of audiences, or create new content, or create new audiences. And equally, when it comes to creating a collection or archive or documentation of a situation like this, there is this kind of a civic or social responsibility that a lot of professionals, museum professionals, feel in situations like this. So at the same time, there's also kind of this is often, and in most cases, it's a new territory. It's all new kind of work, all kind of new ethical and other practical challenges. So there is a particular issue here or challenge how museums and galleries can bridge this kind of urge sometimes to document, to archive, to put themselves forward, but at the same time doing that in a way that is professional, that is ethical, and navigating this kind of new landscape. And that is not always a clear there isn't always a kind of a clear path here. And we've seen from examples of other museums and galleries in the past where they, as I said before, can try to document terrorist attacks and archive spontaneous memorials. They themselves found that they had to think outside the box. They had to create new practices around collecting, around engagement, and sometimes, yes, fall back to what they do already, fall back to their collecting kind of policies. But often museums and galleries don't have a collecting policy that involves terrorist attacks or a pandemic. So how do you go around that? And we've seen from other cases, especially in the States, with a lot of terrorist attacks there, museums and galleries will go beyond their kind of collecting policy and create new collecting policies almost in parallel or even after the act of collecting. So this is, I think, for me, it's a very interesting kind of issue here that traditionally museums and galleries, what they do is they employ their professional expertise, their very kind of the institutional kind of policies that they have, and an experience that is built over decades or even more, to undertake a number of collecting or documentation projects. That's what they usually do. But in cases like this, I think somebody has mentioned before about agility. There needs to be agility. There needs to be almost kind of a leap of faith here, and also kind of falling back, not necessarily to existing policies, but falling back to your professional ethics, and be a bit kind of confident that even if you're dealing with something new that you haven't experienced before, a pandemic or a terrorist attack in the work that I've been researching, there are a lot of things you can draw on, and museums have kind of been doing that. Museum professionals have been doing that, that ensure that the process that you are going through in terms of developing a collecting project or documenting the pandemic itself is based on kind of sound, kind of professional, as I said, kind of ethics and practices that allow you to have the confidence to undertake a project like this, but also to have the confidence to go beyond what you know already or what you've experienced already. So kind of change the practice, kind of do something that you haven't done in the past. And undoubtedly, I think there will be a point where also audiences, even if, and I think some of them have already been asking those questions, they will ask, what have museums done or are currently doing to document the people's experiences, to create a national memory around those kind of the way people experienced the pandemic, and I think that is not again something an easy question to answer, because here we need to be thinking about different kinds of contexts, the local context, the global context. Also, we also need to be thinking about different types of communities. I mean, the fact, for example, that BME communities have suffered COVID-19 much more than other communities. How does this impact on a collecting a documentation project that the museum is going to take? Also, I think somebody else again mentioned the effect and the impact that this kind of work has on museum professionals. I think this, we cannot underestimate this kind of impact. The vicarious or the secondary trauma that a project, a collecting project, a documentation project can create has been identified in in the literature when it comes to other types of crises like terrorist attacks or natural disasters. So it's going to happen. So we need to prepare for that. And museums and galleries need to train their staff and need to make to create kind of those kind of structures through which members of staff feel supported to undertake projects like this, and also to opt out from projects like this. Not everyone should be involved in collecting COVID-19, collecting experiences of COVID-19, or creating, as I said, an institutional or a local or a national memory around that, because this is an event, an experience that has created unbelievable pain for people, including museum professionals themselves. Before, and this kind of goes back to what I said before, there is this urge and the need for people and museums, institutions to kind of to step forward and undertake those kind of collecting and documentation projects. And by all means, a lot of them have already done. But now, as in the context of that kind of rapid response collecting or rapid response in many ways. But I think now we are entering into a phase where we actually need to kind of pause and step back and kind of take stock, see what has been done already. As some museum professionals are going back to work after the furlough, or the other way around, perhaps, as museums are losing staff as a result of the effects of the pandemic. I think this is kind of a time also, as I said, to pause and reflect on where we are and what we can do longer term now, because those kind of challenges are not going to be able. We're not going to be able to address them in thinking kind of short term. It's a long-term project now. Collecting documentation is going to be a long-term project for museums and galleries, and that might include both collecting physical material and digital material. So that is another kind of challenge that museums will have to face, given that most of kind of museums around the world actually have been focusing around collecting kind of physical items, material items. That might not be the case in this particular instance. It might not be possible or even desirable to do physical collecting. Digital collecting might be a better approach here. So again, those kind of questions need to be asked, I think, and as I said, a lot of museums have already done that. But it's time to slow down now, from my point of view.
I think, as you've said, Kostas, as other panelists have also kind of suggested, there is a kind of ethical challenge here. There's an ethics of care. We're in a situation which is both universal and yet extremely individual. It's heightening the kinds of inequalities that we were already aware of, perhaps not tacitly acknowledging or doing anything about as much as they should have been. And we can see that across all kinds of lines of whether it's race and ethnicity or class or gender, or, you know, across every single kind of potential structural inequality. The way that we respond and the people that are left behind or the people that are not taken into account, all of these factors need to be kind of explored to find out how to make this so-called new normal. I think that you've all said quite a lot about the sorts of ethics of care, and what I'm hearing as well is that there's a sense of responsibility from different parts of the arts, cultural, creative, heritage sectors about somehow looking after society. As we began with a discussion today about kind of broader creative industries, and hearing about the Policy and Evidence Centre, the PEC, from Giorgio, and the centre is specifically set up to look at how research can inform policy and evidence. I wanted to ask you all if you could think about and tell me what you felt were the messages that we should put together and give to policymakers from your perspective, from the perspectives of the institutions you're working for. What are the kind of key messages? Is it too early to be able to deliver a kind of set of recommendations about what should happen next? Are there some very specific things that you think need to happen immediately? So if I can ask you first, Kostas, is there something in particular that you think that for the museum sector that needs to happen, and that policymakers in this country or perhaps worldwide need to ensure?
Yeah, so I mean, there are obviously one can think of a number of things that should happen by policymakers in this case. But what I would say is that every cultural organization is its people, its members of staff and its audiences. So if we accept and we agree on the statement that the arts and culture bring benefit to our society, we take this statement and translate it into actual policy and actual taking care of those institutions and those organizations. So no museum or gallery will be able to do serious work around recovery after the pandemic if they don't have the workforce. So I think one of the first things that needs to be made very, very clear to the policymakers is that those kind of cultural organizations need to be supported to continue existing and doing this kind of work. For me, that's kind of top of the agenda. Mm-hmm. And actually, in relation to that, if I can be cheeky and say one more thing, is and this comes from again from the work I've been doing around the aftermath of terrorist attacks. And if you look at the recovery policies, kind of the city recovery policies of how cities kind of recover after terrorist attacks, arts and culture are usually not there. And that's quite strange, actually, because in many ways, the kind of the art institutions and our practices and so on are what people turn to find solace, to find that kind of sense of identity and community after a crisis, after a traumatic event. So it is rather odd that the kind of national or regional or city policies do not include the arts and culture organizations and work as part of the recovery process. Just to give you an example, if I take you back to the 7/7, the attacks in London, immediately after the attacks, what we've seen was that a lot of people who kind of went to museums and galleries in the British Library and other places not so much to find kind of safety, kind of physical safety, but I think the way it was interpreted by the members of staff in those places was that they almost wanted to go to a place that feels that they identify with or they represents them. And I know there's a number of questions here about whether cultural institutions represent and who they represent, so we can talk about that, of course. But they're part of our own identity or people's kind of identities. So that's for me the kind of second point is make arts and culture part of the recovery process, or acknowledge that they are part of the recovery process and add that into the policy making.
Okay, maybe I could bring in Giorgio. It seems to me that that's something that you were saying was part of the finding of this, the early findings from the OCI tracker, that actually people were turning to consumption online, cultural consumption online, as part of and sort of an intervention, or it could be an intervention for recovery.
Yeah, I think I really like what Kostas was saying. I think it is true. I think we live pretty dramatic times, and there is, if you think about different actors, I think it is impossible for one actor to go on their own. So I think it's really the government together with industry and with society coming together on a wider sense. Of course, Kostas was referring a lot more to the role of communities, if you like, and the regional sector. On a national scale, I think it is also extremely important. And what you've seen in this pandemic, in a way, has been a massive reaction by all actors, right? Industry responded very quickly, but society responded very quickly as well. And in a way, government needs to partner with this to, with industry and with society in order to find the right solutions. I think it's a lot about getting ready. I mean, Wendy was very much referring to a case that is interesting because she was referring to a case, at least that's how I understood, of a model or a museum that was quite ready to act and reacted very quickly. Not every organization is able to do that, and I think in terms of understanding how organizations that are less ready could become more ready, I think that is one important issue. At the same time, on the consumption side, it is extremely important. You were mentioning this is not just related to culture consumption, is related to all other areas, especially education in general. The issue about inequality and access to content is a pretty dramatic issue, an important issue that should be addressed. As in any crisis, crises normally affect inequality pretty badly. So it is extremely important that we bear that in mind, that there is investment put so that in the progress that we are seeing, and in the future that might be a lot more hybrid than the past, there is still we're still in a democratic future where access to consumption and content and culture for all the goods that Kostas was mentioning, they're accessible to everybody.
Okay, thank you. And Wendy, I mean, just picking up from what Giorgio was saying, thinking about education, which you were saying in terms of the partnerships that are being developed or have, already sort of existing for the Manchester Museum and working with education. Are there things? Are there policy directives that would help with the kinds of work that you lead on, community engagement, or what would give you confidence that you can continue in a positive way?
Well, I think one of the things that is happening in Manchester across the city and the different cultural organisations that I've noticed anyway, there seems to be less of a hierarchy in terms of the different institutions or organisations. And I can't put the emphasis on how important it is for the cultural leaders of our city to be able to work across the different sectors and in demonstrating the relevance that culture and the important role it has to play in sort of rebuilding and the recovery plans for the city and for communities and the society wider. I think also in terms of education, it's how we link with education and tourism, and I do know that they are cultural leaders in the city are working very closely with local government and looking at what the role is that we play, not just in terms with education or with public health, but actually around tourism as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, rather than culture being that add-on, it's playing that very political, the importance of their political role as well. Mm-hmm. In influencing policy. So we are part of a couple of the all-party parliamentary groups. One is around the curriculum, which we've been working with, and also around the recovery plans too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, seeing it from a city regional perspective is extremely important, isn't it? And yeah,
I think the hyperlocal, I know we're talking about the digital, but talking about those audiences and the inequalities that do exist and those that don't have that access. Mm-hmm. I think that the museum and cultural organisations' role in terms of that hyperlocal is vital at this stage.
Yeah, thank you. Becky, last but not least, what are the kind of noises that you pick up from your work with Camerata in the classical music field? What are the key policy imperatives for your work?
Well, I can keep it super brief, and I can just say freelancers. The Musicians Union did a recent survey of its members and found that 38% are ineligible for any government support. And the creative industries are looking to lose around 287,000 freelance roles in 2020. So please don't forget about the freelancers. I mean, there's plenty of people fighting our corner on this issue, but as yet, we've yet to see any proper support for them.
Okay, thank you. So I think that we should finish ideally on a positive note, and I think I'd like to thank you all very much for your very powerful and impressive demonstrations of kind of research and knowledge making that's been happening during this time, whether as a practitioner or as a researcher, how we understand how to respond, what kinds of research, what kind of data, what kind of knowledge, and how we can then develop kind of suitable policy responses is absolutely critical and ongoing. It's not going to, the issue we were just discussing about the kind of precariousness of a lot of cultural work is something that we've known about, and inequalities that exist within the creative and cultural sectors. We've known about that for some time. COVID is making it worse. So how do we really develop research that can support changes that will leave a better situation than we're in now as a result of coming together during the pandemic? So thank you.
Thank you everybody for today's really interesting discussion. We'll be posting this seminar on social media, so if you do have any questions for our speakers today, we'll continue the discussion at #UMM Humanities. Thank you very much.